Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I'll be making a lidded bowl from 2 cherry blanks and white marbled epoxy resin. This one follows on from a project I did a couple of months ago. That one was a simple bowl, whereas this one takes the design a bit further. So without further ado, let's get into it. So you join me whilst I'm reducing the diameter of the first cherry blank. I'm doing this so it'll fit into the casting bucket. It doesn't have to be that precise, and I don't need to face off the ends. Once that was done, I trimmed a piece of softwood down to use as a waste block. Again, this didn't have to be a specific size, something around 5 inches would do, though I did face off one end. I superglued the waste block to the cherry blank, then I mixed a small amount of epoxy resin, coloured with white mica powder. I used this to prime the surface of the softwood and the cherry blank. I did this to hopefully stop the wood soaking up the resin when I did the main casting. With all surfaces primed, I put it to one side for 20 minutes. Casting the blank was the next job. For this project I mixed 3 batches of my favoured epoxy resin, coloured with white mica powder. Each batch is mixed at a 2:1 ratio for around 2 to 3 minutes. I'll just show one being mixed. With all 3 batches done, I left them to stand for around 10 minutes. This was to allow the primer coat a bit longer to cure. Pouring the resin was straightforward, though I did put a small amount in a silicone measuring cup to be used later in the project. With all the resin poured, I added weight to the top of the blank to stop it floating, then I put the whole thing in the pressure pot, along with the measuring cup. Screwed the lid down nice and tight, then added 50 to 55 psi. This was then left overnight to cure. It's the next day, and with the blank out of the casting bucket, all looked good, with no visible cracks or voids. So I moved over to the drum sander to sand the top of the blank and get it level. And I sanded the second cherry blank at the same time. My initial thinking was to glue the 2 pieces together now, but I was concerned about accurately centering the blank on the lathe, so I decided to cut the mortise first. After marking the centre point and drilling a hole for the woodworm screw, I fixed the first blank to the chuck using the tailstock to hold it firmly in place. Before cutting the mortise, I had to get the blank balanced, and I also wanted to check the joint between the resin and the cherry blank was parallel to the base. To do this, I used the Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher to remove the waste material, cutting down to fully expose the surface of the wood. Switching to the 3/8 bowl gouge, I shear scraped the remaining resin from the cherry blank, and after a quick check, the joint looked good. There was a slight bit of runoff, but nothing that would affect the finished piece, so it was on to cutting the mortise. Cut the mortise. First I levelled the base with a bowl gouge and skew chisel. Then I defined the outer edge of the mortise recess with a 1/4 inch parting tool, and then I removed most of the inner material at the same time. Next I cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter. Then I removed the tailstock, cleaned the recess out with a gouge, and added some decorative rings. Mortise done, I sanded the underside from 80 to 400 grit. Then I added a finish, again just to the underside and mortise, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. Just to be sure, I levelled the top surface and dished out the softwood waste block so it didn't get in the way when I glued the top blank in place. To glue the second blank on, I used rapid set epoxy resin mixed with white mica powder. This was spread evenly across the top surface of the lower blank, and then this was placed on top of the second blank, aligning the grain in the two pieces of cherry the best I could. This was then left for 30 minutes for the epoxy to fully cure. After the epoxy had cured, I refixed the blank to the lathe using a 4-jaw chuck in the mortise and the tailstock securely holding it in place, and then a set 2 with a bowl gouge, getting the top rim section to round. A quick retighten of the chuck, which had been knocked loose by the vibration, and then I roughly shaped the underside of the rim. I did this to see how much material I had to play with, as I would be parting a piece off the top to be used later on for the lid. To cut the top off the blank, I used a thin parting tool. This was super sharp after a session on the Pro Edge and diamond stone. The cherry cut very easily. I pushed the blade in about 3/4 of an inch, then removed it and cut down one side, making the slot slightly wider. I repeated this until it was just over halfway in. At this point, it was making a lot of smoke and not cutting, so I finished it off with a handsaw. So with that out of the way, I began shaping the outside. For this I started with a full-size carbide cutter, removing the waste material, creating a flowing line between the two cherry blanks. This wasn't the finished surface, but it gave me a better idea of where the end design was heading. The project this is based on has a pedestal, so this will have one as well. Using the bowl gouge, I cut into the cherry, alternating between the top and bottom cut lines, cutting deeper with each pass. The cutout was coming together well, though when I stopped the lathe I got my first look at two fairly big cracks in the resin. I could see all the way through to the softwood waste block, but I would have to deal with them when I got closer to the finished shape, so I continued refining the outer surface. The base was next. It was too big for the bowl design, so I used the gouge to reduce it down to match where the cutout met the resin. This made the edge thicker, so I thinned it down with a gouge, reprofiling the cutout and blending it back into the resin midsection. Another check on the cracks confirmed there was still only two, so I finalised the cutout using a detailed spindle gouge to refine the transition angle between the upper and lower cuts. Then I finished off with a skew, blending and fairing the surface. To fix the repairs, I mixed some more rapid set epoxy with white mica powder. This was dripped off the mixing stick into the void. For a start I had to keep pushing the resin back into the void, but as it began to cure, it stayed put and I was able to do both repairs at the same time. Hopefully this would fill it enough so that I wouldn't have to do the inside later on. "30 minutes later and the repairs had cured, so I used 80 grit sandpaper to grind away the excess. I did a bit more fettling with a mid-sized carbide and sanded to check for tool marks, and the outside was more or less done. I would do the final sanding later on. So on to the hollowing out. First I needed to cut through the cherry blank. For this I used a bowl gouge, slicing through the wood from the outside edge towards the centre, stopping short of undercutting the tailstock. I wanted this in place until I'd got rid of most of the weight. I do this for safety. I'm sure I'd be able to get away without the additional support, but there'll be that one time when I get a bad catch or the mortise breaks and the blank will launch itself off the lathe. So if I can prevent it happening, I'll take the inconvenience of limited access. Once I was through to the underside, I concentrated on making the opening wider, finding the edge of the resin midsection, then cutting down into the waste block. The rim was next. I roughly shaped the sweeping curve from the edge down into the bowl, then using a 1/4-inch parting tool, I cut the recess for the lid to sit into. With the lid recess cut, I could now set about removing the rest of the waste block and thinning the side wall down. For this bowl, I wasn't too worried about the finished thickness. The rim opening defined the top at around 3/8 of an inch, and the rest would be there or thereabouts. Using the carbide cutter, I removed the excess material, try not to leave any ridges, stopping frequently to check my progress. And when most of the waste block had gone, I switched to the gouge to cut away what was left of the centre support. the support removed and the tailstock out of the way, I could do the final shaping of the inside. I used the gouge to get rid of the worst tool marks, then I switched to the small negative rake scraper to refine the surface and blend and fare the base into the sidewall. To finish the rim, I squared up the recess with a 1/4-inch parting tool and fared the top curve with a large negative rake scraper. Then I sanded both inside and out from 80 to 400 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the resin midsection. After sanding, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. I followed that with 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away till no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Then the acrylic polishing, beginning with Polarshine 10, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polarshine 5, another single coat, thoroughly polished off to leave the resin with a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's the bowl done, but remember, it's a lidded bowl, so after fixing the offcut section to the chuck, I set about making the lid. I kept the offcut in the same orientation to match the grain pattern, so the underside was first. I wanted to form a dish to reduce the weight, and the bowl gouge seemed to be the best choice. I shear scraped from the centre to the outer edge, but there was a problem. The blank was flexing, and try as I might, I couldn't get an even surface, so I switched to reducing the diameter to suit the recess in the bowl. Whilst reducing the diameter, I decided to remove the uneven surface and start again. The blank was still flexing, but not as much, so I kept on removing material, checking frequently to make sure I didn't take too much off. And once the lid was at the correct dimension, I used a thin parting tool to mark the edge thickness, then I finished off the underside, dishing it out with a bowl gouge. Then I sanded from 80 to 600 grit and added a finish, topped off with gloss finishing wax. I turned the lid around and shaped the top. Keeping this a simple design seemed to be the way to go, so I carefully shear scraped a slight curve from the centre down towards the edge, leaving a small flat spot in the centre. The small negative rake scraper took care of refining the surface, then I sanded to 600 grit and added a finish, again topped off with gloss finishing wax. And now for the final piece, the knob for the lid. This is what the small measure of resin was for. I haven't done this before, but I wanted to try it out. So after fixing it in the 4-jar chuck, I set about shaping the resin into something like the profile of the bowl it would sit on. I used the mid-sized carbide to remove the bulk of the material, then I switched to the spindle gouge and skew chisel to get it to its final shape. I used the parting tool to form the lower part and the locating pin, and after refining the shape, it was done. Then I sanded all the way to 3000 grit and polished it with Yorkshire Grit and Polar Shine 5 and 10. Polishing done, I reduced the locating pin to its correct size, cut it free with a small pull saw and epoxied it to the lid, and it was finished. And that's it, another project finished, and I'm very pleased with how this one turned out, and I hope you like it too. The cherry against the marbled white resin looks great, and the simple design with the addition of the inset lid just completes the look. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.